My name is Natasha Udensiva. I will lead this panel, chair this panel. I'm teaching a course on Russian energy, geopolitical and geopolitics of energy in Harriman, and also advise a couple of capstones in SIPA on energy. I have Tatiana Mitrova here. We have a distinguished panel. Tatiana Mitrova, who is the head of the Department of Oil and Gas of Energy Institute in Academy of Science in Russia. We have Adam Shrier, who has been long professor here at Columbia and also advisor to governments and investment banks and companies in Central and Eastern Europe. And we have Tim, and I'm very sorry, your last name, it's a little bit tricky, Tim sorry.
Boersma.
Team Bushwa,
very good.
Who is at Brookings Institute, a fellow at Brookings Institute, and an acting director of Energy and Security Initiative. So our panel is on energy. Tim was telling us that she feels like the weather is cooperating because it's so cold, for New Yorkers at least, not maybe for Muscovites, but for New Yorkers it's very cold, so it's cooperating with Arctic team. Well, maybe yes, but oil prices and low oil price environment, definitely not. So when you're thinking, like talking in this oil price environment, talk about Arctic energy, you're thinking, oh my God, what we're talking about, because the lowest, according to businesses, the lowest feasible price developing Arctic will be like $70 per barrel. Nevertheless, 2 days ago, I think BP issued an annual report where it's, according to BP prognosis, saying that prices will go up very soon, that oil and gas industries actually come back, kick on the block, and we will have the rally in oil and gas industry very soon. And Russia will continue to be one of the major and remain one of the major exporters of oil to the world, and U.S. shale rally also will continue. In connection with that, my first question, we will have Q&A panel. My first question to Tatiana: let's say in 5 years. Do you think Russia will need to tap into Arctic resources just to maintain the same level of production? And that's first question, and like the two-part question, sorry. And another one, what's the price tag to that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. Really great pleasure to be here. Well, look, it's all the experts agree that at a certain point oil price have to go up. The major issue is timing, when exactly, and how we are going to survive during this period of low oil prices and how long it will last. So in our forecast, by 2020, hopefully oil prices will go up to $45 to $50 per barrel, so probably we are not that optimistic as BP is, but of course it will depend largely on how long low prices at 30s will stay, or even, God bless us, 25 or below that. So anyway, 50 is already a price when many of the projects which are currently being frozen or postponed will get in, and they will become economic again. Actually, I think Norway was already stating that most of their shallow water drilling is acceptable at $35 to $40 per barrel. Russia actually has just one similar project, which is Prirazlomne, which is like 20 meters depth. Nevertheless, it's an offshore platform, otherwise you couldn't extract this oil. as far as I know, actually the long-run marginal cost of this development was enormous, something approaching to $100 per barrel. But once the investments are done, actually you just regard them as sunk cost, and you are looking only at the operational expenses. And they are not that high, so it would be absolutely economic to expand production, what Gazprom Neft is now doing. Actually, they are doubling production next year. So there will be some growth in Arctic offshore oil output even next year, which seems to be a terrible year in terms of prices, like this year is. And then actually another question is, there is Arctic and Arctic. So what do we regard as Arctic? I mean, not all, major part of Russian gas is produced currently in Arctic. Yamal Peninsula and actually Nadim Portas area, it's all formally, if we look at the slides of the previous session, it is all Arctic onshore. So definitely it will go on. They have very low costs. And answering your second question, well, for oil and for gas condensate, which is also produced there, that could be $15, $20 per barrel, which is quite competitive even now. And for gas, well, it's below $1 per MMBTU. On average, that would be like $0.5 per MMBTU production costs, and this is also supported by a huge ruble devaluation, which has happened last year and in the end of 2014. So actually, all costs in rubles, all ruble costs in dollar terms, they more than halved, which is making Russian hydrocarbons, again, very, very competitive. So there will be this production of oil, there will be this production of gas onshore in Arctic. I really doubt that before 2020 there will be any other expansion of offshore production except for Prirazlomne. But later on, potentially, if the oil prices will go up faster, if there will be, I mean, this boom and bust cycle, which we are observing all the time, if it will go again high to something like $80, $100 per barrel, then probably some of the deeper offshore developments would become desirable again. And the first candidate, of course, it will be Rosneft drilling in Kara Sea, which was initiated before the sanctions, which is now frozen both due to the sanctions and due to the low oil prices. But it is, again, it's rather shallow waters. It's 80 meters depth, so it's not comparable with Stockman, for example, which was like 340 meters, and I don't think that it will be developed anytime soon. But with these deposits in Kara Sea, it looks that they've really discovered something very attractive. So far, it's very difficult to develop it, but having like 5-10 years in order to find other suppliers of equipment, including Chinese companies, which are actually negotiating this. Probably Rosneft will be already able to develop it on its own, even given that sanctions regime will stay in place, which is another uncertainty to which I do not have any answer. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting because Prirazlomne always seems like, oh, they're like not producing anything, but they're actually producing like 16 million I think tons per year, and you're saying it will be 32.
Yeah.
Interesting. For you, Adam, and like more geopolitical questions. Let's say, okay, can U.S. allow itself not to drill in Arctic when Russia is drilling?
Okay, well, since this is more of an industry panel, from an industry point of view, that's not too difficult a question, because whether to drill or not to drill depends on geology, economics, and to a lesser extent on government policy. Whereas from an international relations point of view, it's a very different question, which I'm going to dodge. I think the important issues, as Tatiana just pointed out, and which this morning's panel mentioned in passing, are the sanctions and the oil prices, which is what deters activity in Russia, which is a much more attractive opportunity from an international investment point of view than the U.S. at the moment. Russia has more oil, it's got more markets, more favorable conditions for the U.S. There is still the problem of, if you find the oil, how are you going to get it to markets? I was reflecting on this, that we are now 50 years beyond the point at which the North Slope came in, 49 years ago. And at that time, we had no idea how we were going to move that oil. But it was the biggest discovery to date in North America of an individual oil. And we explored pipelines, we explored tankers, we moved a tanker through the controversial Canadian waters that we heard about, and got oil to New York from Alaska by ship. We built a pipeline over territory that everybody was puzzled by. Is, could they do it? Does it have to be buried? Does it have to be elevated? And what is it going to do to a lot of habitat and environmental aspects? And the technical problems were solvable. And the economics more or less worked. It worked better for the pipeline, as it turned out, than for the tanker, even though in theory it should have been the other way around. And so we built the Alaska pipeline, and that has been sending between 1 million and 2 million barrels a day to the lower 48 and other markets for 30 years. So I think the industry question is really, is there oil there? And in Russia, there's no question about that, oil and gas. Second question is, are the markets there? And that there is a question about. In the long term, I agree with Tatiana that sooner or later, prices have to go up because the world is moving from 7 billion people to 9 billion people, and everybody wants to be middle class, which means they want to have cars, they want to have air conditioners, et cetera, et cetera. So at some point, demand is going to catch up with supply. At the moment, we have a near-term supply overhang, which is keeping prices down. There's a conference going on simultaneous with this one in London, which is an annual event. It's called IP Week. It's actually a whole week of discussions. And leaders of the oil industry from all over are coming. And even though they all start by saying they're not price forecasters and they try to dodge that, they all wind up saying something because it's necessary as a confidence-building measure for the leader of a big oil company that has any capital investment whatsoever and is answerable to his shareholders to be able to say, yes, prices are going to recover. We think it'll be in the near term, within a year, within 2 years, or something like that. They really don't know. They really don't know. But they have to say that.
Right.
And in the long run, they'll be right, because in the long run, they will recover. Notwithstanding the meeting, COP21, which said we're in a period of transition. We are, over a half a century. But in between now and then, before we abandon fossil fuels, we're going to have to produce enough oil to support all the people in Africa who don't have electricity today, all the people in India who don't have electricity, and all the people in China who also need the resources. So I think the answer is prices are going to recover, drilling is going to have to resume, and the Russian Arctic is the biggest game in town. It's got the most territory, it's got the most resource.
So basically you're saying that American companies would love to come to Russian Arctic.
Yes.
And like not so much drilling around Arctic.
Exactly. Well, to turn that question around, I once did a study here with students to look at Eurasian investments in North America, because there are now Russian and Kazakh and a few other companies investing in North America, oil and gas. And the amount of interest is relatively low, and the capability to finance the investments is relatively low. So really, if you're talking about international investment, it's going from here to there rather than from there to here. If you talk about technology, there's no question The reason ExxonMobil was so welcomed by Rosneft in the Kara Sea is because they couldn't do it themselves. If they could do it themselves, they wouldn't want Exxon. They tried BP first. That didn't work out for a lot of reasons, so they went to Exxon as a second choice, and it's worked out very well. They made the one discovery. They were ready to go. Had it not been for the sanctions, that would have gone ahead. The rigs were moved into the territory. The first round of sanctions did not prevent Exxon from going ahead with the drilling, since the equipment was already there and the money had been paid, the contract was already signed. So that they got permission to drill, but then the sanctions were tightened up on this end.
Right.
And so they had to stop. They got permission to wind down gracefully instead of just packing up their suitcases and leaving. And as a result, that's now on hold, which is not a bad thing given the market. That with a poor market, you don't want to keep.
So they
putting money
probably,
in.
glad to be on hold at this
Yeah,
point.
a little bit on hold, but if they can, they will resume. And they've had a good relationship, unlike a lot of Western companies. They had a good relationship with Rosneft in Sakhalin. The Sakhalin 1 project compared to Sakhalin 2, which is Shell and Gazprom and et cetera, it was much more successful. So those two companies know how to work together, and absent government factors that intervene in normal business progress would continue to operate.
Right. Thanks. Team, I know you want to talk about environment, and the question is, there was a lot of have been said about potential disasters and potential cooperation, but actually, can you be more specific? What can really be done together, considering right now the kind of like cold climate?
Well, thanks for the question. Thanks for the invitation, of course. I think a lot has been said in the previous panel. In case of a, at this point, theoretical oil spill, at least in the offshore waters, the capability to do something about that is very limited, of course. And even though at a national level, it seems to me that all the actors are at least working on or have in place response mechanisms. You have to bear in mind the vast region, vast area they're covering, the harsh conditions they're doing this in, and so it's at this point in time virtually impossible to be fully prepared to do something about it. The good news, I guess, is which both my fellow panelists alluded to, that at this point in time that is not more than a theoretical concern. It's something that you can start working on now, and you have time to actually do that, because it may be quite some time before we get into a large-scale commercial resource extraction in places where this is actually of concern. The shorter-term concern has very little to do, but which is related, has very little to do with energy resource extraction, but with vessel emergency responses. So as conditions become a little bit more mellow, if you will, in the Arctic, you see more and more tourists be interested to go up north. And from what I hear, the chief concern of the Coast Guard and other actors is that one of those vessels gets in trouble in the high north, and at this point in time, there's virtually very little that one could do about it. And so that is the short-term concern, is not necessarily related to energy resource extraction whatsoever, more than it is than the regular concerns that one would have with resource extraction more broadly worldwide, not specifically to the Arctic. So what one could do, in the previous panel, there was, I think very correct and right observations about at a sort of a working level, very constructive dialogue that has long featured in the Arctic. And even though in the current geopolitical climate, some of those efforts may be further complicated, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be pursued, and it also doesn't mean that no extra effort is required to maintain that constructive dialogue. Because interestingly, the Arctic has been a place where the Arctic powers have been able to agree on topics where, on a national level, it may have been very difficult to actually agree on. And it's worth reminding, I think, that it was not that long ago that it was not just in Russia that climate change was a complicated matter. In the United States, it was too. And finally, in the Arctic Council, if you look at past statements there, actually all these powers could agree on that this was a real issue and that they had to spend time on, even though at the national level that was at the time not really an issue they could constructively talk about. So that constructive dialogue, I think, is worth pursuing. More complicated in the current geopolitical climate, but nonetheless equally, if not more important, to pursue.
So basically, what you're saying then, when it is a matter of surviving, it pushes, both sides to cooperation.
Well, maybe, but it's also from a practical point of view, that's the right thing to do. I mean, there's no way that each Arctic state is gonna sort of contain the Arctic, if you will, on its own. That's just not possible. So even if you, from an efficiency point of view, it makes a lot of sense to do this collectively and search for areas where you can work together, rather than inventing the wheel all on your own.
Right.
Looks like a very inefficient thing to do.
Well, all that said, there was someone said on the panel that Lavrov may be not coming to the next Arctic Council meeting, and if that's the true, then kind of the cooperation is deteriorating.
Yeah, that's of course that's true, and the question from the audience earlier about the deteriorating climate, spot on. That is, of course, the context that you're operating in. But I'll reiterate that doesn't mean that we're going to have to say, okay, if Mr. Lavrov doesn't appear, then that's the end of it. It's not, right? As another speaker on the previous panel alluded to, the Coast Guard Forum, I think, is an important signal that I guess not at the ministerial level, but at a lower level, there is an intention and a willingness to work together. Something worth preserving, and again, I think it's in the interest of all the actors to continue to pursue that.
Thank you. Tatiana, coming back to you and to Russian Arctic a little bit. Can you talk more a little bit about this development Arctic onshore? Because I think it's underappreciated a little bit here, and I always tell students, look at Bovanenka, that is above the Arctic. It's a huge gas field that has been developed, and there are a lot of new technology has been used, and also Yamal. Can you tell more what is happening there?
Well, I don't have any presentation or map, but I think you can imagine Yamal Peninsula. On top of it, you have Kara Sea with all these potential new developments. And below, there is this core area of the Russian gas production, Nadim Purtas. So all the big three, does it work? No? So all these big three fields, gas fields, very famous, Urengoy, Yamburg, and Medvezhye, which constitute like 70% of Russian gas output, at least that was the case until recently. They were under development since early 1970s. And they were providing the bulk of all Soviet gas production. Now they are obviously in a declining phase, losing like up to 20-25 billion cubic meters per annum. But they have deeper horizons. They have a lot of smaller satellite fields around them. And what is most important for the gas industry, they have all the infrastructure installed. So there is a huge system of gas pipelines. There are several hubs, not trading hubs, but technological hubs. And all this pipeline system is actually bringing gas from Western Siberia to Central Russia and to Europe. So there is this connection with the major markets. In gas industry, actually, these transportation costs, they provide approximately for 50 up to 60% of the final delivered cost of gas. So once you have it, you will definitely try to utilize it as much as possible, because these huge investments, these are billions of dollars, tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars, I would say, in total invested. And definitely Gazprom and independent gas producers, I mean, Rosneft and Novatek, not that independent, but nevertheless, that's how they are called legally. They are trying to develop primarily all their assets, all their gas-producing assets located in this area. Moreover, they have more and more gas condensate production in these fields, which is actually like light oil. Yeah, so it makes a lot of sense to focus on these developments, and it is not just these big old Soviet type fields, but numerous smaller fields. There is a lot of associated gas from the oil production also in this area. So Tyumen is not so far; it's a little to the south further. So this is the area which is providing in total probably like 70% of all Russian hydrocarbons. Of course, it will be the first area to be developed, and it's the cheapest resources. So if there is a need to cut costs, to save on everything, to be extremely efficient, this is exactly the area where all the companies will focus on. They will not go into Eastern Siberia, they will not go to Caspian offshore or something like that. They will try to improve their performance in the northern part of Western Siberia, which can be regarded as Arctic formally. Yeah.
What is the price for production?
It depends on the old oil fields. That could be like $8-10 per barrel. It's very low. It's more expensive than Saudi Arabia, but probably nobody else can compete with it.
And
for gas, it's about $12-15 per thousand cubic meters, or it could be now even lower because of ruble devaluation. So that's really, you will keep producing it nearly at any price, whatever happens in the market. And infrastructure is there. You can evacuate all these hydrocarbons to the markets in a very cheap way. These are all sunk investments. So you need just to pay for transportation tariff, and that's it. So there will be this production ongoing. There might be delays with the introduction of the new fields. So all the companies had their quite ambitious plans to put on stream new oil fields, new gas fields. Looking at the market, you understand that actually there is not that much demand for additional hydrocarbons, and the prices are not so attractive. And Russian oil and gas companies are actually short of investments. So due to the financial sanctions, actually it's much more difficult to loan money from the Western banks, and Asian banks are also requiring much higher interest rates. So it's quite logical that companies start to cut their investment programs. For example, the last year Energy Ministry announced in their presentation that it's approximately 25 fields for which their development will be postponed at least for 2 years because of the sanctions, because of the low oil prices. But generally it doesn't result in any catastrophic collapse of the Russian oil or gas output. So there is plenty of resources. The question is when there will be a favorable market conjuncture to produce them all.
Thank you. Adam, back to you. And again, a little bit more energy geopolitics. Let's say tomorrow sanctions are lifted. Do you see that business, energy business, is running back to Russia? Or, I'm not saying right now about prices. It's more concern, it's the question more, is the trust there right now?
Trust in the Russian government or the U.S. government?
Both. Well, I'm talking actually about business trust.
Yes, so am I. To a company like Exxon, they have to worry about actions of all governments.
Yes.
And
right.
so anything that can disrupt the risk situation, it's not a question of the market. The
Yes.
market can be improved,
Okay.
prices could be back up. But if the political situation is unstable, is variable, volatile, that's a deterrent. That's a deterrent. On the other hand, it is a long-term business. And so looking at a development in the Kara Sea, finding oil today means producing oil 5, maybe 10 years from now. So we're not talking about an overnight kind of thing, but there's got to be confidence that things will work out over that period of time. That one, you can undertake activity now, and two, that when the activity leads to revenue-producing production, that you'll be able to achieve that. So it's a little more complicated than a presidential order saying sanctions are lifted effective immediately. But that's part of it. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry I can't give you a more definite answer.
Oh, no,
but
no, no.
it's not a simple
That's
question.
actually, yes, and it's actually, in a way, definite answer that there is no any definite decision and solution. So it will take time to come back.
Right. I mean, the companies will always say that they intend to comply with all the requirements of the law. And whatever they do, they say, as we know, we have complied with all the requirements of the law. Their expectations are somewhat different matter. Every company has a ranked inventory of prospects. Where should it be investing its money? And things move up and down on that list depending on technology, on economics, and on politics.
So basically what you're saying that, yes, sanctions are lifted, but the risk of political risk, it's not clear when it goes in a perception of
Exactly.
Of companies.
Right.
Tim, and to you, again, continuing the environmental, we know that, and I think it has been said also here, that Russia right now developed a lot of more strict environmental laws. But at the same time, Russia is known by not really have a lot of laws while it has a lot of laws on the paper, it's not very good in implementing these laws. So is it a concern right now for environmental community when we're talking about environmental in Arctic? Is it a concern for other countries?
Not sure I'm the person to answer that. I will observe that implementing environmental legislation worldwide is a challenge. This country too. If you read the newspapers just last week. But on Russia specifically, I'm not sure if I would call that a challenge. I don't think I'm in a position to call that. I will say that, on environmental issues, climate change related issues, seems like an area where the Arctic states broadly, and the U.S. and Russia, I guess in particular, have a lot of issue areas to explore collaboratively, if you will. And I think that one of the areas that hasn't been touched upon in great detail is permafrost melting, which I guess I would like to mention. So it's a common problem across the Arctic, and permafrost melting is important for a number of ways, very practical reasons that it causes, and it's unfortunate that we don't have slides and nice pictures, but it causes railways and roads, etc., to sink, which makes very practical daily life complicated. And there are great examples of this, both particularly in Canada and in northern Russia, of course. It results in coastal revetment, so sinking infrastructure, relocation of communities, and so on migration, and so it's a real problem. The other and less, well, maybe also practical, but the other consequence obviously is that with melting permafrost, a lot of trapped methane potentially is released into the atmosphere. In light of concerns about climate change, released methane ought to be an equal, if not a larger concern. But surely one big one. And so the IPCC, just to give you a little bit of perspective, estimates that permafrost in the northern hemisphere will decline by 20 to 35% just mid-century. And to say, so the estimates are, at least the National Academy of Science estimates that in that permafrost layer, anywhere between 1,700 and 1,800 gigatons of carbon is stored at this point. And to put that in perspective, current carbon content worldwide is estimated at around 730 gigatons. So we could, depending on what scenario you take, but if you look at the 2 degrees Celsius line, which is one that climate scientists like to use, and by now, given since the Paris Agreement is also endorsed by a broad political coalition. That would mean that you can emit roughly not more than another 1,000 gigatons, which is significantly less than what is trapped in the permafrost layers. So that's an issue area where scientists have been looking at for quite some time, but where there's an incredible amount of questions that are not answered about what to do with this and how to address this problem, both from a practical and a climate change point of view. So I'd address that, throw that in just as an area of shared interest, concern, and possible cooperation.
So my last question to all panel, and I think we're all here, is trying to understand and find maybe some answers about potential cooperation between Russia and U.S., if it's possible, but there are so many things that have been said that it's needed and it's not impossible. It's not possible to develop Arctic without cooperation. And I know you're kind of like we're touching different points and from different angles, but I just want to hear your thoughts. What steps can be taken, or any steps can be taken right now? I know it's not much kind of, depend on us, but at the same time, everything depends just on people, on real people, what they're doing and what they're connecting, what images we're projecting, what we're saying in front of the audience. So what can be done from that point of view? Where can we move from here? In energy, in climate, in submarines, whatever, facing each other. It's too little space there. We have to communicate.
Yeah. Okay.
Who wants to pick up the first?
I'd be happy to take a first crack, and I think that that my apologies up front, because again, a lot has been said in the first panel that I would fully agree with. But the context matters, which complicates sort of high level cooperation at this point, certainly in a number of forums. Nevertheless, certainly possible future oil spill prevention, emergency response, more broadly, not just in the energy sphere, but for vessels, would be important areas where you can work on. Now, the Coast Guard Forum provides a platform where you can do this, as mentioned in the previous panel. More needs to be done. The Coast Guard indicates, in terms of oil spills, for instance, that even though on a national level, efforts have been made and are being made, more coordination and interaction also between practitioners from various Arctic states to learn from one another, to learn from indigenous populations, seem very fruitful next steps that, in my humble opinion, ought to be able to take place, even though the geopolitical climate is chilled.
Yeah, I think the morning, the first panel covered a lot of the areas that are fruitful for cooperation. Certainly scientific research and exchange of information, the navigation, search and rescue, environmental control, those kind of things. They're cooperative by nature, because ships of many nations are going to be involved, many flags. And I think that an interesting concept is the exchange of people, because at the base, that's what it's going to come down to. And the suggestion that we have Americans on Russian Coast Guard vessels and Russians on American Coast Guard vessels, very, very good one. That has worked very well in other parts of the world, where sometimes bridge-to-bridge communications between international navies are difficult because of language problems or protocol problems or whatever. So I think there's promise there. The oil spill response is a particularly troublesome one, because it is potentially a huge problem, and it's very difficult to anticipate. As I guess we heard this morning, that whatever we do, we're not going to anticipate the next disaster exactly. There'll always be something that goes beyond our capabilities. But there are networks of response centers that could be set up cooperatively along sea routes that can address those kind of issues as they come up. When, again, going back 50 years, when we looked at a Arctic tanker transit of oil from Alaska to the east coast of the United States, we knew we couldn't afford the number of icebreakers, we meaning the companies, much less anybody's Coast Guard, couldn't afford the number of icebreakers to accompany each vessel by its own icebreaker. The first voyage that was made by the SS Manhattan in 1969 had 2 icebreakers because of some intergovernmental discussion about who had jurisdiction. We had a Canadian icebreaker leading, and aft we had a U.S. icebreaker just in case. And so everybody, there was no formal agreement, but it was kind of understood. Everybody was kind of putting their marker down. And then the Canadian government passed a Pollution Prevention Act, which gave it extended jurisdiction in what they considered internal waters, and still do, as far as I know. So it gets complicated. But what we thought of as a practical solution for commercial service, had we gone the ship route as opposed to the pipeline route, was stationing icebreakers at certain intervals, and to the extent that the ice-reinforced commercial vessels ran into problems, there would be an icebreaker available to help them out at various intervals. So it's kind of like cell phone towers, kind of passing responsibility from one to the next. And that way you could do with 6 icebreakers what otherwise would have required 20. Okay. So it was kind of a solution. And that's just, I mean, that's 50 years old. I'm sure people have better ideas now, and communications and instant response are better now than they were then. So but it really comes down to individual small steps. It's very hard to see a global solution. I was very impressed, was a very junior person. I was at the conference that adopted the Marine Pollution Convention, and leading up to that, there were a lot of discussions, and different state interests were represented. It was a UN-sponsored activity, and the flag states had their views, and the port states had their views. Well, the one place where I saw pretty consistent cooperation and working together, and this was 1973 at the height of the Cold War, was the U.S. and the Russians. It was largely because of naval issues, but still, the U.S. and the Russians saw things very much eye to eye in terms of innocent passage and servicing subs and all those kinds of things, which otherwise the convention would have created problems with. So there are possibilities for cooperation, and they can be very practical steps that could bring the 2 countries together. Regardless of what's happening in the Caucasus or in Ukraine or any place else. I mean, these are regional problems that can be solved regionally.
Yeah, as more I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that maybe in a weird way, Arctic can become this point of diplomacy and like melt, other, relationships in other places. Like maybe rosy hope, but that's what I think. Yeah.
Well, I'm probably a bit more pessimistic because I'm ready to speak only about energy issues, not touching maritime transportation or safeguards or climate. But I mean, in the energy sector now, given the sanctions, I can hardly see any way to proceed, because sanctions are targeted exactly at the Arctic stuff and at shale oil, which could be actually a solution because most of it is also Russian shale oil. I mean, Bazhenov rock, it's also located in the region which can be regarded as Arctic, but again, it's untouchable. So any sort of technological cooperation which would be really useful, it becomes impossible. And here I would suggest only one idea, probably, at least not to hurt it further, not to make it worse, because a lot depends on the explanations of the sanctions, and we have seen it already in the case of Sakhalin-3. Forget about the map you saw, Sakhalin-3, Sakhalin is also Arctic. Yeah, that's the explanation which the State Department has given. And it actually destroyed the resource base for Sakhalin-2 expansion. It was a really very painful thing which occurred in summer 2015. So year after the sanctions were implemented, actually they were expanded, to put it clear. Yeah. And I mean, any additional further expansion of the sanctions would further destroy the relationship. So I would suggest just at least to stop where we are, not to cross further this red line. And in this respect, I think actually Yamal LNG, which you mentioned, might become such a symbolic project if the U.S. will, let's say, allow it to happen without any interventions, without any attempts to impose any additional sanctions or to hurt it somehow, then it could be regarded as the first sign that, okay, despite all the difficulties and misunderstandings, at least we are not like teenagers trying to hurt each other. Yeah, so, and especially, take into account that it's exactly the timing when the U.S. LNG will come to the market. So if something will happen with Yamal LNG due to the U.S. sanctions, the clear explanation would be, they are destroying their competitors. Yeah, so at least I would suggest to be very, very cautious and hope for the future. Anyway, Arctic is more or less frozen because of the prices. So anyway, we have like sort of natural pause in all these developments, and I would suggest to use this pause at least to somehow rebalance our interests and to find some more or less appropriate way of communicating and, living together on this planet.
Natasha,
Yes?
if I could just add, Tatiana said something which reminded me. There is a silver lining, which, not because of the sanctions so much as the low oil prices, the market has a disciplinary and a stimulative effect on innovation. And to the extent that low oil prices set the hurdle higher, companies get more creative. Mm-hmm. And in Norway, unfortunately it didn't happen in U.S. or Russia specifically, but in the Barents Sea, mm-hmm. there was a lot of discussion just in the last few months in Norway that low oil prices are going to destroy some of the high north production. Mm-hmm. And Statoil figured out a way to cut the costs by a very substantial amount, not 5 or 10%, but like 50% of a development that was in question. And that development is going forward, even at low oil prices, because they've been able to control the cost side. So there can be some creative thinking that goes on with low oil prices. And the sanctions are a different issue, but as far as the low oil prices, they can be compensated for.
Yeah, it's actually a great point, and necessity is mother of creativity. So basically with sanctions, maybe that also push Russia to come up with its own technology.
Yeah, well, for the country which had its first man in the space, it's definitely something doable. It's we've always had good engineers and good technologies. The problem was just to implement them, just to make them on the large scale available in the industrial performance. So now, of course, once the sanctions were imposed, all these discussions on import replacement and development of our own industry, they became most important and urgent, and quite a lot of money is allocated from the state in order to support these industries, especially maritime shipbuilding and all this stuff. So definitely there will be some results. What is actually frightening me in this respect is, as is usual, this money are allocated to state corporations, which are probably not the most efficient companies to perform it. But anyway, looking back into the history in the industrialization which Soviet Union was going through, I think there are many hopes that just mobilizing all the resources, attracting all the money possible, and mobilizing all the people who still remember something, we will be able to develop these new technologies. I wouldn't say that there was a good track record during the last 10 years. All the efforts to create new technologies in Skolkovo, in other technological parks, I wouldn't say that they failed completely, but close to that. So But nevertheless, when a Russian character is that we are becoming really efficient when we are in the corner with no way to go. So probably, indeed, the necessity would really drive some progress in the technologies. At least we have no other choice. I mean, Chinese probably will help in certain areas, but they do not have many parts of the equipment lacking.
Talking, I think the last. Thank you very much. One more remark, like you're talking about industrialization, made me think that actually, even during Stalin times, the whole industrialization has been done with the help of American and German engineers. So I think we have to keep it in mind, Russia has to keep it in mind, and it seems like through the history, Russia needs West, but West also needs Russia. On that, I want to turn to the audience, to the questions. Yes, thank you. Kim.
Thank you to the panel. I'm Kim Martin, Barnard College and the Harriman Institute, and a special thanks to Lou, who helped really put the panel together. I'm very grateful to him. My question is to Lou, actually, which is that you and I had talked about, outside of the context of the immediate panel, one of the unexpected consequences of the declining interest of industry in the Arctic is declining interest in supporting sort of social programs that include science development and perhaps indigenous peoples related programs. And I'm wondering if anybody on the panel wants to talk about those unexpected consequences of oil price decline.
Anyone?
Well, I'm just thinking about a good example on how it works. Stockman project was regarded as a driver of the whole Kola Peninsula development, and they were talking about the new research center, and they were actually, the idea was to gasify the whole peninsula using this gas from the offshore field. Now, when the project is postponed for absolutely unclear period of time, there is again a problem how to deliver gas to all people living there, and how to find jobs for them, because it was in the regional development plans, it was one of the most important sources, places for employment. And now Gazprom is requested by the local governor either to provide Stockman, which is not feasible, or to gasify the region and to provide additional jobs. So, I mean, this social responsibility, Gazprom even didn't step in. It didn't have time to start doing something there, but it has already obligations from the very beginning. So without marriage, it is nearly capable, responsible for paying all the penalties and feeding kids, which are not his kids, actually.
Can I think it's a great question. I think you touched upon the chief frustration of Senator Murkowski, who is greatly frustrated that there seems to be very little concern about job creation in the state of Alaska, and whether that argument is right or not. The fact of the matter is that without energy resource extraction, the economic opportunity for locals decreases dramatically. We did a study about 2 years ago in Greenland where the problem is fairly similar. There, you have a huge resource base, and the local government would love to tap into it. And at the time, resource prices were still suggesting that could be economically viable. And they were going to tap into it just to become an independent country. About half of their revenue comes from Denmark, and they'd love to see that reduced, as would the Danish government, at least the majority of it. So the idea was, okay, if we can extract those resources and create jobs, and we're talking not just about oil, I think we're in the shorter term mostly talking about mineral resources, so iron ore, lead, zinc, perchance rare earth elements. Then that would create jobs, create independence, etc., etc. With declining commodity prices, obviously that is now a long-term scenario and no longer realistic. But the consequence is that one of the chief promises, if you will, for the locals that was there to create, large-scale jobs. If you operate an iron ore mine, you're talking about 1,000, 2,000 jobs per chance, which is significant if your population is 55,000. That is gone, and the alternatives are fairly limited. You have a fishing industry; it's not very labor intensive and less labor intensive. And then the argument of the environmental community is often, well, you have tourism, but this is still a very niche market, and most people would still opt to go to the beach instead of going up to the Arctic. And the time that changes is not anywhere in the nearby future, it seems to me. So I think this is an important point. That local economic opportunity is an important angle to take into consideration.
You want to say?
Well, this is really outside the area of what the oil companies are thinking of doing. But I would say that it's become accepted, maybe reluctantly at first, but it's now an accepted part of oil exploration activity for foreign investment situations, for there to be what are called social spending clauses in the contracts. And they often go beyond supporting the local symphony or building a statue or two. They involve schools, they involve medical centers, they involve infrastructure, and now, to some extent, that may be a hard pill to swallow for a country that has the capabilities to do it themselves, but when that becomes part of the deal, that's extra revenue and extra capabilities in project management and everything else that comes with the oil and gas contracts. The other thing I would mention is the indigenous people are very aware of this and are very unhappy that while places like the Arctic Council deal with governance in the broad sense, the indigenous people feel that they have not had their full say. The composition of the Arctic Council, the kind of meeting participation has been extended to include indigenous groups, but one still hears from indigenous sources that the money, as one of the speakers suggested this in the first panel, the money tends to flow south to the national capitals, whether it's Copenhagen or Moscow or Oslo, and does not remain in the area where the resources are. So it's an issue. I mean, I don't have a good suggestion there, but I certainly think you've got a good point to make.
Oh, there was first, I think. So this guy. This one with this center. Okay. I'm just taking by turn.
Hello, Matthew Bauer from Thomson Reuters Special Services. I hear a lot about cooperation. We're talking, and this might sound like a security-related question, but I promise it has a market perspective. So Russians have already claimed right to the Arctic natural resources up to the North Pole based upon the extension of Lomonosov Ridge. So the current Russian territorial claim encompasses 480,000 square miles, roughly. And recently, Denmark, a NATO country, made a territorial claim that directly disputes Russia's claim to the territory of the Lomonosov Ridge. Now, from an investor standpoint, from the energy sector, does this scare people away when they see these territorial disputes, based upon the volatility of the composition of the Arctic Council? Russia's the only non-NATO state in that. So how does this affect the market when it comes to the future of the energy sector in the Arctic?
Great question. Lou?
Well, I would love to bounce that back to this morning's panel, because it's a claim that has to be acted on, and that can take a very long time. So from the point of view of a potential investor, one has to assess what are the chances that the decision is going to be made, that there's merit to this claim, and that it stands unopposed by the counterclaim, which is extending from Greenland to the North Pole instead of from mainland Russia to the North Pole. So I think it's remote, but it certainly is a factor. I really don't know how it's viewed in the boardrooms of the of the corporations. I do know that the geologists see a place for them here because they can analyze the chemical structure of the material that makes up that ridge and compare it to the chemical structure of the mainland and see if that's a piece of the mainland that broke off or is an independently created perturbation in the Earth's surface. But I don't know what the answer is, and I'm not qualified to comment on that. It's remote, I would say that.
Yeah, it's just a consideration. I will not say anything about what happens in boardrooms because I have no idea. But but I think it's worth considering that the majority, and I'll refer to my two colleagues here for the exact percentage, but a significant majority of the proven reserves, both oil, gas, minerals, are within the exclusive economic zones of the various Arctic states. So claims for new swaths of land, in my view at least, would not necessarily really change that risk calculation, other than that rhetorics may add to a certain political risk perception.
Let's get.
Hi, David DeBroat from EIR and the Schiller Institute. I was very interested in what you were discussing in terms of the spirit of cooperation, the nature of cooperation in the Arctic, the way the inherent characteristics of the area force a certain amount of cooperation based on reason and science. It reminded me of the kind of spirit that you get when you talk about space and space exploration, where you can't have petty geopolitical disagreements. One idea that hasn't been brought up is the idea of a Eurasian or a world land bridge, a system of rail connecting the world with a keystone in the Bering Strait, which I believe brings a spirit of cooperation to Earth, where nations can actually build the basis for economic development. Now, my question is, how do you see this idea in terms of, because part of the idea is not to simply build a route from point A to point B, build a railroad from Moscow to New York, but to create, in a sense, an artery of development, the potential for inland development that you don't otherwise have right now in the Arctic. It's a much too harsh of an environment. You set up a transportation corridor, and you do have that environment. So I was interested in what your opinion was of that, especially in relation to what Mr. Shrier was bringing up in terms of the Arctic primarily being used as an area of resource extraction rather than an area of development.
So, who wants to take this question?
Well, I know it sounds a lot, what you're suggesting sounds a lot like what the Chinese are suggesting on a more limited scale from Beijing to Europe. They have this one road initiative which they present as a development strategy, but is viewed with some discomfort by a lot of the Central Asian countries, not to mention countries further west. I mean, I think it sounds better on paper than in practice myself. But other than that, sure, if anything that builds cooperation is good, great. But it would really take a lot of negotiating, and I'm not sure how it impacts the development of the Arctic as opposed to development of transportation corridors from the Far East to, say, Europe, Western Europe, which are certainly needed, and that's one of the rationales for the Northern Sea Route, is you can take Samsung televisions from Korea and deliver them in Southampton a week earlier than by traveling through the Suez or around the Cape. So sure, it's a transportation saving. I don't know what it does for local resource development or the people living along the route.
I am Pavel Bayev from PRIO, and my question is to Tatiana. I am more than a little flabbergasted by the continuing recycling in the Russian debate on the Arctic of one particular piece of data, which is the assessment of U.S. Geological Survey from the beginning of the previous decade about the volume of hydrocarbons in the Arctic. And by now it has become clear that they got that assessment spectacularly wrong, and there is no shame in that. They were dealing with undiscovered resources. A lot have been discovered since then. And it's going on again and again in Russian debates. The same factoid goes on recycling, now acquiring the characters. As everybody knows, the Arctic contains about 30% of the whole hydrocarbons in the world. So my question to you is, do you know of any reliable Russian assessment of what is there offshore in the Arctic, really, besides the U.S. Geological Survey from the early 2000s?
No. I mean, I don't know any open sources of information. There are some estimations made by the State Commission on Resources, but they do not disclose it. And if I'm not mistaken, actually they are not, again, they are not allowed to disclose it because you remember this regulation which was making Yamal and Khanty-Mansiysk Autonomous Okrug not resources, not disclosable. It is back again. So, and actually some of gas resources are also now qualified. So I'm afraid that there is simply no legal, transparent source of information. But moreover, I mean, there was such a small exploratory work done that it is, I mean, the range of these estimates, it could be like from 0 to any figure you wish. Even in eastern Siberia, the rate of exploration is like 8%. In Arctic, less than 1. So how can you rely on these figures? It's all very, I mean, all these cabinet estimations are of similar quality.
This gentleman.
Joram Kimberg, YK Capital. Question, 5 to 10 years from now, oil prices go back to whatever, 40 to 60. Who would come first, the Chinese collaboration or the U.S. collaboration within the next 5 to 10 years? To my knowledge, the Chinese are financing projects in Russia now, so are the Koreans. The U.S. obviously are shying away.
Yeah, so it's very easy to answer. You've actually answered your questions. Of course, Chinese, they are already there. They are participating in Yamal LNG. Yeah, most likely they will somehow collaborate with Rosneft in Kara Sea. At least they are negotiating it right now. And actually, you've all heard about negotiations on Vancor deal. You've all heard about potential privatization of Rosneft, which was, first of all, proposed to our Chinese friends. Yeah, so anyway, it looks like China will get more and more involved in Russia's upstream, and as major part of this upstream is located in the north of Western Siberia, of course they will get there. And they are very much interested in the Northern Sea route development, so that's one of the reasons of their participation in Yamal LNG. So I'm sure they are regarding it as a strategic possibility, and they are already building like ground for this large-scale involvement. I do not see any signs that they will step back at a certain point.
Yes.
So in 2000, my name is Devansh. I'm a student here at the journalism school. So there was a Russian media source in 2012 which said that 80 to 85% of all the ships along the Arctic route are oil freighters. They're carrying oil and other minerals. Greenpeace also wrote a long report about how oil is leaking into the Arctic from the Russian side and the disasters of that. So I just wanted to know, like, are there any numbers on how many ships go along the Arctic route? Who is transporting oil to who along the Arctic? Like, I'm trying to get some numbers on the possibility of disaster, because I think like right now it seems to be the most, like, it's the most imminent environmental disaster facing the Arctic. So I was just wondering what is there on that.
I couldn't give you a literature reference, but there are very good statistics on the number of transits and the tonnage that travel through the Northeast Passage. Regrettably, the trend has been down. It probably peaked in 2013 or thereabouts, and it's been going down ever since. And that's distressing to the Russian authorities that were anticipating a continued growth. It's likely to be temporary, but those data are available. I hear them most commonly discussed, actually. There's an annual meeting of a group which is not the Arctic Council, which is an intergovernmental group, but the Arctic Circle, which is a broader umbrella organization discussion group, and it meets in Iceland every year, usually in October. President Grimson has been a kind of a patron of this, and there you get more industry participation and more discussion of actually maritime commerce matters. And there are people there that present slides, which I don't have, but which show the number of voyages, which ships, what they're carrying, and all this kind of stuff. So there are data. I just can't give you a specific reference.
How many? Oh, okay. And how much more time we have? Just maybe one more question. One more. Okay. So.
Just the administration of the Northern Sea Route has a website, English version, and they publish all the statistics over there. Just Google administration of the Northern Sea Route, and you can find all the statistics.
Okay, there was a hand. Yes. You mentioned. Wait a second. Wait. Do you need microphone? And introduce yourself, please.
You mentioned two giants,
Can
British
you introduce
Petroleum.
yourself?
Oh, Earl Thompson, Harvard Law School, private practice, tax lawyer. You mentioned two giants, Exxon and BP. They're as big and strong as many nations, many small nations. Which is going to survive better and invest more after this big crisis in the price of oil?
Okay. That's something for the stock analysts to comment on.
First, you have to publish disclaimer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think they both have had their experiences. Let me step back and answer it this way. When the former Soviet Union first became accessible to Western companies, there was a tremendous rush to enter. And there are stories galore of different experiences. Business schools will survive for the next 100 years on case studies of companies that have entered and what happened to them. Unfortunately, the best case studies are the failures. And there were a lot of failures, a lot of disappointments with dealing with local authorities, dealing with the central government in Russia, and so on. And this really applies to all the former Soviet Union, not just Russia. But the two you mentioned have had success in different ways. Exxon, by going into Sakhalin, creating an opportunity to participate for Rosneft, even though Rosneft really didn't bring much to it other than the brand name and the Russian government blessing. BP went a different direction. They had one very bad experience where they lost $750 million because of some mysterious asset switches and things. And so but they tried again with private investors, and there they got into unending scuffles over management of their venture. So while all the focus was on the problems they had, even President Putin intervened a few times and said, I keep telling them, somebody's got to be the boss, and it can't be a 50-50 management, which was what they tried. And in the end, that venture dissolved, and that led to BP actually losing out on the Kara Sea opportunity, which was going to be their opportunity rather than Exxon's. Exxon was a substitute. On the other hand, if you look back at the financials, BP, to a large extent, rode as a company on the profits they made from their Russian involvement for an extended period of years through the last decade. And so they did very well while that venture had all its turmoil. It was like a soap opera where there were disasters and insults and changes of management and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, the revenue kept flowing and largely kept BP very viable despite the Deepwater Horizon and all the rest of that, financially. So somehow they figured out how to do it. I don't know who you would predict. Hopefully both, and many others besides. CNPC is there now, as Tatiana mentioned. They're not a shrinking violet. They will look for their place in the sun. Indian National ONGC is also participating, so far in a small way, but with time can be expected to be more active. So there's going to be more players once business resumes. Right now, as we've said, it's kind of on ice, but it's too hard to tell who's going to do well.
Yeah, just one finger comment. Don't forget, BP has approximately 20% of Rosneft. Mm-hmm. It's the largest shareholder after the state, so they are in.
Good point.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the panel. Please, let's, thanks our panel. And thanks for listening and being present at our discussion.
And everyone, we will reconvene at 1:30 after a lunch break, and our 2 afternoon panels will both focus on military and security issues. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful morning of this conference.